Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Artificial Intelligence. I think this is our fourth virtual evidence gathering meeting, and I'm very pleased to say that at each meeting the attendance has been increasing, and so you're all, each and every one of you, very welcome to this. Now, obviously, with potentially 200 plus participants, we have to have some house rules, which I will just run through as more people come into the room. I think we're now up to getting on for 80 participants. And as I'm sure you're all aware, because you have had the invitation and seen the agenda, that we will be discussing this evening face and emotion recognition technologies and how we can regulate those to protect our citizens and their privacy. And to help us explore that, we have a panel of 7 excellent but quite diverse speakers who will help us take us through that particular topic. As we're sure many of you have done Zoom meetings now, wherever possible, if you can make sure that you are muted so that we don't get too much background noise going on and potential distractions from the person who is trying to speak. Now, we use both the Q&A section and the chat function on Zoom. If anyone would like to ask questions at an appropriate point after we've heard from our 7 speakers, please use the Q&A. Those will be curated by Desiree, who's around here somewhere, and she will make sure that we pick up the themes that are coming out of those questions. And when we get to that section, I will then go to her and ask her who we should be going to. I'll then call out your name and you get to ask your question and you'll be unmuted. I think that's probably all I need to say at this point. I'm sure if there is, if I've missed anything out, Desiree will correct me, but I think at this point what I'd like to do is go to my co-chairman, Lord Tim Clement-Jones, who will just also welcome you and lay out a little bit of the background of this, and then I'm going to go to Birgitte Andersen from the Big Innovation Centre, who acts as our secretariat and helps us organise and run these meetings very efficiently and makes us one of the most active all-party groups in Parliament. So on that note, Tim, over to you.
Eden, thank you very much indeed, and a very warm welcome to our panelists and to all of our virtual attendees. This is a really important area of debate and discussion, and I'm delighted that we've gathered together such an authoritative group of panelists to talk about this. I don't think any of us are instinctive regulators or keen on over-regulation, but when even the Metropolitan Police Commissioner talks about live facial recognition technology, for example, as Orwellian, then I think we have to sit up and take notice. And when you then add to that concerns about the governance of live facial recognition technology from RUSI, the Information Commissioner, the Ada Lovelace Institute, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Big Brother Watch, the Science and Technology Commissioner Committee, the Biometric Commissioner, and even the Home Office's own Biometrics and Forensic Ethics Group, I think you have to sit up and take notice and think, well, what are we doing with this technology? Should we be regulating? Should we indeed even be deploying it? So I very much, we're going to have a good debate today. I should say that we did invite Lindsay Chiswick, who's the Met's Director of Intelligence, to come along this evening, and she was very keen to do so, but sadly had a personal commitment, which means she can't come. But obviously, whatever we decide, whatever we discuss will be reported back to her, and I very much hope that she will be able to come and talk to us on a future occasion. So I'm going to hand over to Birgitte. Birgitte.
Thank you very much, Tim, and also good evening from me. For those of you who are joining the all-party parliamentary groups online for the first time, I want to say that a big aim for us, of course, is to align a technological opportunity with business models, with citizen participation on policy and regulation and so forth. So really the output should be touching upon all these different groups. Normally meetings can be quite specialized, but on face recognition, of course, in this case here, it's not so specialized because it relates to everything about running smart buildings, smart cities, smart health, living more smart. But also we need to focus on what's the purpose of applying face recognition in all these contexts, the ethical considerations, the security considerations, trust, sustainability, and impact. So there are lots of things to discuss tonight, and I look forward to hear everybody. And I will now hand over, because we've got so much to go through. But I want to say that this is definitely not a specialized element. So I do also expect a quite variety and broad conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Birgitte. I think that sets the background really well. Now, we've got 7 speakers, and I hope that each of our speaker panelists have been told that they've got 5 minutes to talk to us. I'll try and keep time, but if you could also make sure that you try and keep to time, because it's if we were in the Houses of Parliament doing this, I'd glare at you and wave and say, can you wind up? That's not so easy on Zoom. So please, if you can, try and stick to your 5 minutes. If it goes over too long, I will have to try and interrupt so that we can get through all the presentations and we can then make sure we've got plenty of time for questions. So our first panelist is Professor Nadia Bianchi-Berthouze, who is Professor and Deputy Director at UCLIC. Nadia, over to you.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me. So I'm Nadia Berthouze. I'm a professor in affective computing and human-computer interaction at the University College London. I've been investigating the design of technology that can sense people emotion for many, many years now. And I've been doing so in real life context, not in the void, really to understand not only how to design it, but also why and what we need to consider when we design it. In this very brief talk, I like to just bring up a couple of points. One is to understand the benefit of this technology, and I've been asking to focus on the working context and the commercial setting, and also to consider, as I said, what are the factors that should drive the design of this technology to make sure that it fits and answers the need of the users. So first of all, working with industry in various settings and in the health context, one of the benefits of this technology, it can help drive the design of working environment that foster well-being and not just productivity. Designing technology that is able to sense a person's affective state may help people become more aware of the trigger of the stress in working environment, or a setting that facilitate a more successful and fulfilling working setting. People are very bad at identifying these triggers. They just realize they are very stressed when it's too late. And we have seen designing this technology that this technology trigger reflection and reconsidering practices, working practices that are more successful for the person. And the same data can be used by company to design environment and practices that help their staff. Similarly, we can create a fair environment where people are more aware of their biases, or a more empathic environment where people are more aware of their colleague. Often we work under pressure and we're just driven by the pressure, by the desire to complete our work. In the commercial setting, this technology has the potential to help to create services that are a better fit the needs of the consumer. And making sure that we don't just push people, for example, of buying, but that we really fulfill their desire, their need, and they're satisfied. And this means to go towards an economy that is more sustainable. However, to design this technology, we need to really understand what people need are, what the important affective state are. Often we design this technology just thinking to the basic emotion, happy, sad, surprise, and thinking to facial expression. These are not always the modality and the emotion that matter in a particular context. If I think to the commercial setting, to the salesperson, a salesperson is really good and really want to help the consumer. It may be reading their way the person is moving while he's trying out a dress, not just to understand if the person is excited because he's buying something, but what does the person really want? Does he want to feel elegant? Does he want to feel comfy? Does he want to feel sexy? And that body movement more than the face may advise the salesperson in what the person really wants. And not only this, but the salesperson will also try to see if the person embarrassed, is the person confident in their body, and this will advise the salesperson in how to interact with the person, not just on what to sell the person. So understand what we need to recognize is the big challenge. And this goes beyond the simple emotional state, but it has to be studied in the context of use and not in general. So it's not just about AI, but it's about working with experts in the field, working with the user, understanding their need in that specific context. I think I reached my 5 minutes.
That was excellent. Thank you very much indeed. If there is more you wanted to say, you have an extra couple of minutes. Yeah. I hadn't realized the first two speakers have got 8 minutes each. So if there's more you wanted to impart, please do. And then I'll hand over to Tim, who will have a follow-up question, I'm sure.
Okay, so for me, this last point is very critical because often industry come to me and ask, I've been using this off-the-shelf system that recognizes emotion and the basic emotion, and it's not really working, and it's not really, I don't know what to use it for. And I really ask them, is this what you are interested? Is this what matter in that specific context? Have you investigated with the user what kind of affective states are important and why, and in what way we can use them to better serve them? I think it's a really important question and a big challenge, as emotion to recognize may be more complex than the simple basic emotion that are always addressed.
Thank you very much indeed. Excellent. Tim, did you want to?
Yes, I just really wanted to follow up a little bit, Nadia, because you talked very eloquently about, in a sense, the benefit of the technology. You've talked about how you, in a sense, make it fit for purpose as it's developed and so on. But what kind of ethical framework are you using when you consider whether to actually deploy it or not? Because isn't that one of the big issues? I mean, this isn't quite like medical research, but it's very close to it, isn't it?
Yes, I think my colleague Olugbade will follow on that. But for us, what is very important is that, first of all, are we addressing really what benefit the user? That's very important, because I think we have to design to fulfill those, first of all. The other important thing is that people need to be aware that they are sensed, need to be aware of what is sensed and how. I think it's very important that this is transparent. The system needs to be working. They need to be evaluated to really understand, to make sure that is being built to address that problem, and to understand to what extent that system is capable to address that problem, because then it needs to be used within its capability. We think it's important that this is a system and the control should remain on people to the extent this is possible. So I think there are so many ethical issues that need to be considered from the beginning, that we start to envisage what the system is for, to the point we deploy it, and to make sure that we can still evaluate the system as this is change, alter, and improve to work in that setting, or shift or adopt it and transfer to another setting to make sure that that system is still fit for purpose.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Tim. Right, just before I go to our next speaker, can I just remind all the attendees that we are using the question and answer section. So if you have a question, please type it in there and Desiree will marshal the questions so that when we've heard from all our speakers, we can go straight into questions. So thank you for that. Nadia, thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to ask Dr. Temitayo Olugbade. I hope that's the right pronunciation. Apologies if it's not. And you've got up to 8 minutes as well. Temitayo.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. So correct pronunciation, Temitayo Olugbade, but you made a really good attempt there. So
Apologies.
It's okay. I'm a research fellow at University College London, and I have a background in applied machine learning and affective computing, so developing technologies for affect recognition. And I would focus on making my points around the theme of data sets. Why data sets? Well, data sets are central to affect recognition technologies, but not just those forms of technologies, but in general to AI systems that are built on machine learning. And in the context of affect recognition technologies, the data sets would typically consist of behavioral and physiological data on one hand and affect labels associated with them on the other hand. So for example, you might have facial expressions, and then you might have emotional labels attached to that. A challenge that is somewhat unique to affect recognition technologies in comparison with other recognition technologies is the fact that affect labels are not absolute truth. So they are not like object categories like a cup or even activity description like walking. Rather, they are subjective interpretations, which could be from the subject themselves, or it could be from an observer observing the subject. And I think this is something to consider. This is something that is important to consider for two main reasons. One is in understanding that the output of any affect recognition system should be taken as inference rather than truth. And this ties in with a lot of discussion that's happened around AI ethics about where in some cases it is important to have a human in the loop setup where you have an AI system and a human decision maker collaborating to make the final decision rather than giving the AI system full autonomy. The second reason why it's important to consider the fact that affect labels are not absolute truths is that contextual information matters a lot. So contextual information could change a human interpretation of physiological or behavioral data. So I might see a person's, again, facial expression, but then if you provide contextual information like what they are doing at the moment. So if they were playing sports, maybe they are in a tennis match or seeing the rest of their body could provide more information about what they are doing. And so it is quite important to account for contextual information when developing affect recognition technologies. Another challenge to affect recognition technologies is differences in emotional expressions. And this could be due to, again, differences in context. So for example, whether I'm alone or I'm in social settings, my emotional expressions will be different. You also have individual differences. So the way I would express joy, for example, would probably be different from how you would typically express it. And so in addition to accounting for contextual information in developing the system, it is important for the data sets used to build the technology to capture the diversity of the scenarios or the individuals that will use the system. And it is important for it to do this in a balanced way. It is also important that related to this, it is important for the technology to be tested rigorously using real life data samples. And this might seem intuitive, but because of the challenge of obtaining data in affect recognition technology development, a lot of data is captured in somewhat controlled settings, whereas this is not representative of everyday real life settings. So for example, even the fact that in real life settings, you would have noisy data from the sensors compared to much controlled settings where you have much cleaner data. And it is important to understand how the technology behaves in real world settings where you have such things that you would not have controlled. And just to say on a final note that I believe that one transparency standard, and Nadia had pointed earlier to the importance of transparency, but I think one transparency standard that could foster this principles, so the principles about having this requirement of using data sets within effective, for development of effective recognition technology, and to make sure that developers follow this, they meet these requirements is, I think, is having the technology developers and the companies or agency that use those technologies to publish publicly accessible information, for example, on their websites, about the data sets that they use to build these technologies and about how these technologies are evaluated, which is usually done using a data set also. So for example, and these are just examples, including information about what kind of data was used to develop the system, the size of the data set used to develop the system, and given that across context and across relevant demographics. It could also include the labels that the system is providing, so the outputs that you get from the system itself. And I believe that this is one somewhat easy way to enable public involvement in the discussion around affect recognition technologies and even AI technologies in general, which is something that seems to have become quite critical to do. And yeah, that is all for me. Excellent.
Temitayo, thank you very much indeed. Tim, did you have a follow-up?
Yes, I thank you, Stephen. Very interesting, Temitayo. You talked about the development of effective recognition technology and the use of data sets and so on, and the desire for those developing it, using it to be transparent and so on. But there's a very interesting question, actually, that David Ellerman has asked, which absolutely sprung to mind as far as I was concerned as well, which is surely this kind of gathering of data, who does the data belong to? Surely shouldn't it belong to the person whose emotions are, in a sense, being tracked by this kind of technology? Otherwise, there's a kind of invasion of privacy and so on and so forth. So, I mean, what's the approach of those like yourself who are developing this kind of technology?
Yeah, so you're quite right. And data sets is something that has been widely discussed, even beyond AI itself, because, well, they are quite important in the society where we live now. There are regulations that already exist, like the Data Protection Act. How much developers are following that is beyond my own knowledge, but within our own work. So we work in academic research, and in academic research, at least at UCL, I can tell you that we are bound by those regulations. And so in capturing data from participants to use for research, we go through rigorous evaluation. So even within ourselves as a team, in making sure that we are collecting the data lawfully, fairly, and transparently. And so the participants in our research always know that we are collecting data from them. They know what we are using the data for exactly, and we are obliged to make this information quite clear to them, to provide the information clearly, and they can query it. They can, in some instances, they can ask for their data to be removed and that we do not use it. And we also work a lot toward, as much as we can, pseudonymizing the data, so not making it possible for other people to identify them. And so in terms of research, we do follow all of the existing regulations around data use. I think the challenge is, and I think that was what you were pointing to earlier, Tim, with Nadia, is the challenge is probably in terms of deployment. So is deploying the systems is what, and I think that is, I think there's a lot of approaches to consider, but I think one of the things that I believe is would not make things worse and could only help things is to have developers publish information about the data they use. So that even just showing some transparency, okay, where did you get this data? What does it include? What does it contain? And then at least that would give more information for users and the public and other interested stakeholders to then query that further and investigate.
Thank you, Temitayo.
Matthias, thank you very much indeed. Right, we will now move on to our next speaker, which is Matt Celuszak. Matt, are you here?
Yep, sure.
Yep, excellent. Hi, Matt. Yeah, and if I could ask you to keep your remarks to around 5 minutes, if that's okay.
You got it.
Fantastic. Away you go.
Right. So first of all, thank you, Professor Berthouze and Dr. Olugbade. I couldn't agree with a couple more of your points. Having spent 16 years in the human measurement business, I think probably the last 15 have been trying to figure out how to fix the problems. So there are a lot of challenges when you get into human measurement systems. Just a little bit of background. I come from a tech family, West Coast, North America, specifically Victoria, British Columbia, beautiful place. Parents built a tech business. I wanted nothing to do with technology. I got my degree in human kinetics, was very interested in biology in that area. For the last 16 years, I've been working with athletes to help use measurement systems to improve their performance. Then I worked with IMG to help them understand the value of sponsorship and the intrinsic value of sponsorship. Then I worked with Vision Critical to help companies like Nestle, Coca-Cola have feedback loops with their customers on a regular basis to drive some of their investment strategies. And then finally, I started 7 years ago working into the human behavior and observation space. My start was, it was interesting. We started in the emotion space to learn that there were a lot of different things to be observed. So today I'd like to share with you some of the observations. In 7 years, we've collected over 450,000 emotional experiences with people interacting with their technology and devices across 87 countries to create about 2.5 billion data points around attention, emotion, human behavior capture, thought behavior, linking it to about 40 different businesses and their metrics to understand how they're built internally. And I can tell you there's a lot of scars along the way. First of all, I think your point around emotion data is understanding the why and how versus the what, when, and where. So it's a complementary data set. It is not a replacement data set, first of all. Secondly, I think what's really important is that it's informative, not directive. This is a really important point. I think back to the chess match in IBM Blue, but really it's about a machine and a human being working together. Machines are really good at pattern spotting, but they're not great at intuition yet. Now, some may argue, but they're not great there yet. Also, the problems, when you're solving them, you need to start at the end and work your way back. So you need to start with what the company or what the use case is trying to actually solve, and then you find out that actually multimodal is better. So using multiple types of these types of technologies is usually better. But I can't emphasize enough the learning of diversified data sets. So I'm definitely going to latch on to that point. First observation we had is that the universal models were not universal. In fact, once we started looking at the data, and we see a lot of videos from around the world, in order for the universal models to predict accurately, you had to be white or East Asian. You had to have a good internet connection because poor bit rates would make the quality go up. You had to have a good camera, so an expensive phone. You had to not wear glasses, and you had to not have a beard. And these are the big tech technologies that are on the market today that companies are using to make billion-dollar decisions. And they're doing that on the representation about 1 to 2% of the actual population. White, empowered, and wealthy. So that was the first consideration we had to start addressing. And first one was move away from universal data sets. Treat every individual the way it is. Second one is about trust. And the trust one, it took a while. It took us about 4 years to solve all of those challenges. But the second one is about trust. What was interesting is that people will trust you if you're really transparent and give them control. We did that from day one, starting, and our opt-in rates were about 13%. Over the last 7 years, they've grown to about 26%. What was interesting is when you opt in, you have 3 options with us. You can opt in, you could say, no, I don't want to participate. You could say, yes, but no humans can view my data. So algorithms only. And you could say, yes, but it could be involved for research. And I know that I'm up to my 5 minutes. So there goes my alarm. I only have 3 recommendations for Parliament, and they're very short. Be open. There we go. Basically, make sure that your regulation demands openness from your suppliers. Make sure that your regulation demands quality and a focus around quality of data. And make sure your regulation is controlled and safe by design. That's all.
Matt, thank you very much indeed. That was great. Tim.
Yes, Matt, thank you very much. That was very interesting. You talked about the risks, you talked about risk mitigation. What I'm struggling to get my head around is, what are the real benefits at the end of the day of this kind of technology? I mean, you are commercially involved in this, and you say you build technology that enables everyday technology to enable users to observe and quantify emotions and behaviors, both implied or expressed, to improve the human experience. Now, you know, what does that really mean in terms of benefits compared to all the risks that you've set out?
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a number of different use cases when it's applied safely and consensually. I think a great example is teachers today, and the education has come up in the Q&A session already, so I'll take that one as well. But teachers today, when they're dealing with online learning, a lot of students and a lot of their materials, they have to read on their own now. And so how do you actually, a teacher needs to observe when a student's reaching a frustration point. And that's when they typically come in and teach so that student can succeed in what they do. Identifying that observation usually takes a pretty trained psychologist. Now you can distribute that across the systems and create these markers and flags to be able to say, actually, here are the topics that the particular student is struggling on. So then when they come in to class or for a teaching session or tutorial, you could improve on those areas. I could give you also a business side one if you want as well.
Okay, good start. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Matt. That was great. Right, we'll move on to our 4th speaker, which is Dr. Seeta Peña Gangadharan. I hope that's the right pronunciation.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. My comments are going to focus on putting the debate on face recognition into a larger context of equality and justice. I've been researching data and discrimination for the last 10 years, and so I speak with reference to my own research, but also in relation to other social science and computer science research that informs my work. Much of the technical debate around face recognition has to do with the accuracy of models, including rates of false positives and false negatives. But the problem of accuracy, I would argue, is an institutional and historical problem, not just a technical one. Another way of stating this is even the most advanced technical improvements can only go so far to make face recognition systems democratic. These systems can only learn so much from their mistakes when introduced to settings, for example, where public safety strategies are themselves flawed. So let me unpack this. Computer scientists point to two types of problems regarding accuracy in machine learning. The first set of problems pertains to flawed data and flawed models, or sorry, and flawed models. So face recognition systems may misclassify data because they've been trained on flawed data, or something shifts in a training data set that then causes a shift in a model. The second problem pertains to attacks. Face recognition systems might be attacked in ways that interfere with their ability to detect the presence of a face, then extract the face, and then recognize it. What I take from this research is a chilling observation. False positives are a problem from data to model. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, more likely the case, a system can be compromised at many different points in the process of machine learning. The problem which leads to inaccuracies might be due to the persons or institutions responsible for collecting certain kinds of data, which then later get used to train models. It might be the persons or institutions that decide to use a particular type of training data set. The problem of inaccuracies might stem from a system designer or designers who created a flawed algorithmic model, or the institution that gives it the green light. It might be from someone or something outside the system that interferes with system performance. Problems of inaccuracy might arise simply due to the course of human history changing and causing changes in a training data set. Now, graft this technical system onto a social system with entrenched cultural norms and values, which has its own problems of accuracy. Misclassification in a racialized society is also known as racial profiling. If you are of a particular race or ethnicity, you are misidentified as a criminal because of deep-seated notion that members of Black and minority ethnic populations are dangerous and commit more crimes. Being a false positive is a default existence in Black and brown communities. And the problem of false positives, i.e. racial profiling, will only be exacerbated by the wide-scale adoption of face recognition technology. So we can recall some facts about recent analysis of police data and racial profiling. A joint study by Liberty and Guardian found that 22% of Black and minority ethnic people received fines in the UK, though they represent, this is during the lockdown, 15.5% of the total population. And then another analysis done for The Guardian showed that Black people made up 31% of arrests in London during lockdown, despite making up 12% of London's population. So when the problem of false positives and inaccuracy are endemic in society and not only to a technology system, the impacts to society as a whole become even more complex. In the research that I co-lead, we have found that surveillance and surveillance technology works against public safety. It compounds mistrust in those institutions meant to defend and protect public safety. Surveillance contributes to a false sense of security, and I would argue any measures that attempt to solve inaccuracies in the technical system are simply doomed to fail in such a context. Now, just a quick word on some recommendations. Most of the recommendations that flow from our research are non-technical ones, and they concern measures to stop racial profiling. They also involve having frank and ongoing conversations about the need for such surveillance technologies. And in fact, in two of the cities that we've done our research in the United States, these are cities that have been calling for the ban of face recognition technology, specifically in the city of Detroit. So the biggest innovation that the government might support now is one of frank conversation on the democratic implications of, of face recognition. And I think that conversation should happen now, it should be ongoing, and it should happen in a way that asks people to evaluate the costs, whether the costs of surveillance are the costs that we are, as a society, are willing to bear. Thank you.
Excellent. Seeta, that was very good and bang on time, so thank you for that. Tim, I'm sure you have a follow-up.
I certainly do. Very interesting, Seeta. I mean, you said we should have a conversation, but I mean, if you were going to put an opinion down, I mean, is this live facial recognition technology, which leads to what you very interestingly described as false positives, I mean, is it curable? Is it usable? Should we be saying that public authorities shouldn't deploy this technology in the first place? Would that be the result of the kind of conversation you would like to see?
I think that's part of the conversation, right? I think that we absolutely need to be thinking about a ban on face recognition technology, live face recognition technology in public places. It's the type of technology that creates really intense path dependencies. So once you put the technology into place, it becomes harder to undo, right? And when you arrive at a crisis situation, I think you're really going to be confronted with hard questions as to why did we hardwire this system in ways that circumvent normal democratic safeguards.
Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Right, we will move on to Matthias Spielkamp, who I think is there. I saw him a moment ago. Matthias, over to you.
So what is Algorithm Watch? We are a non-profit organization, and it's our aim to evaluate and shed light on what we call algorithmic decision-making processes that have a relevance to society, which means that they are used either to predict or prescribe human action or to assist or make decisions automatically, which I think is clearly the case when we're talking about the technologies we're talking about today, or the systems. Now, being a non-profit, one of the important questions is, where does the money come from? From private foundations and individual donations at this time. Now, what exactly is our goal? We would like to see that automated decision-making systems are used to benefit individuals and society. So this means that we are not, we are an evidence-based advocacy organization. We do a lot of research, also original research. And we are neither adversarial to government and the public sector, nor to private companies. So it is not about ideological or dogmatic stance saying that automated decision-making should be banned in general. It needs to be democratically controlled. So we participate in multi-stakeholder deliberation processes to develop solutions to these challenges. Now, what we also do is journalism, and as I said, research. And what we did is we tried to find out where so-called artificial intelligence is in use by police forces in the European Union. And we found that just by asking the police forces, that it is being used in Belgium, in the Czech Republic, France, Germany, Poland, and Spain. Now, first of all, this was in a sense quite easy to find out, because we asked the police forces and they answered. On the other hand, there is no kind of public register or publicly available information about this fact. Now, the second stage of what we did is we tried to find out who the vendors of these systems are and what information they were able to provide about the systems. And one of the vendors is Briefcam, and they answered to our questions that their software does not use skin tone as a variable, so it cannot discriminate. I'll come back to that in a second. The Fraunhofer Institute in Germany said no details on training data set and its diversity will be made open to anyone outside the institution. The police of Etterbeek in Belgium said that the system does not take skin tone or any other individual trait into account, but they also provided no information about the system's training data set. One Telecom, SNEF, and 2i, they did not comment at all. Now, we already had a brief discussion about this question of reliability and accuracy, and I will squarely support what Seeta just said about this question, that it is a much broader question. And from the chat, I already saw that there are many people who are experts on this topic, but I would like to point you to an example that my colleague Nicola Kaiser-Brill at Algorithm Watch recently revealed. That was in April, where he used a Google system to classify information, pictures, images in this case. And for example, what you can see here is that on the left-hand side, someone holding a thermometer in a dark-skinned hand, this was classified as a hand holding a gun, and in the other case, it was a hand holding a monocular. Now, where does that leave us? Well, basically, what we can find out is that there is no transparency and there is no oversight to speak of when we are coming to the deployment of these technologies in the police forces. Now, we also looked at effect recognition technologies that are similar to what was mentioned today. You may have heard about the discussions of HireView, a video system that proposes to be able to deliver personality profiles just by looking at video of candidates. It is used by such companies like Goldman Sachs or Unilever and others, or Presire that does the same thing with audio recordings. Now, I bring this tweet here from Arvind Narayanan, who said that academic scholars writing about AI screening have taken the company's bait and focus on bias, but a random number generator that doesn't have disparate impact is still a random number generator. Arbitrary, unaccountable, and demeaning to candidates. No semblance of due process. Now, due process, of course, is a big question here because these are usually not some technologies that are used by the public sector. Where does this leave us? It leaves us where we should ask for a clear ban of biometric mass surveillance, meaning in this case that we should ask for a ban of such technologies that are used in public spaces and surveil people indiscriminatorily. So it has the potential to lead to mass surveillance, and this is incompatible with the EU fundamental rights framework, especially data protection, dignity, and the principles of necessity and proportionality, and is therefore illegal. So I will say that we need to put a stop to it immediately and take time to reassess it. Thank you very much.
Matthias, thank you very much indeed. Excellent. Tim.
Matthias, thank you very much. And you've obviously got a very strong line on the use of this kind of technology. And obviously, I've seen you give evidence to the Council of Europe on this kind of activity as well. Is anyone getting it right? I mean, you've listed all the countries where you made inquiries, but is there anybody who actually has produced either governance or a ban or a moratorium that you think is any kind of model for the future?
Well, actually, the interesting part here is, and I left out that slide because I was pressed for time, is that the analysis that I just presented, which was done by EDRI, a network of rights organizations in Europe, basically comes to the conclusion, and I completely support that, right now the use of facial recognition in public spaces that actually try to identify people indiscriminatorily is illegal. So we are in a situation where the law is not enforced on these technologies. It is not like we need to develop new ideas of, I mean, we do need to develop new ideas, but even enforcing the laws that are in place already would lead to a ban of these technologies in these use cases.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. And again, thank you, Matthias. Right, our penultimate speaker is Andrew Budd. Andrew, over to you. If I can invite you to talk to us for about 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thank you to the APPG for allowing me the opportunity to give evidence. So I'm the founder and CEO of iProov, based here in virtual Waterloo in London. We started up in 2013 and we now employ about 60 staff worldwide. I'm an engineer and a serial technology entrepreneur with an interest in regulation. And I lead a company built substantially on AI technology. iProov is a supplier of face-based biometrics to sectors which include finance, healthcare, travel, and visas and immigration. We believe that such systems can be a real force for good in the world, simplifying online life and enabling the digital economy, whilst ensuring through simplicity and security that it can work for all sections of society. Now, my evidence today addresses the difference between face recognition and face verification two applications that are often elided and shouldn't be. Many of my points are equally applicable to effective analysis. I will also just touch on the relevance of an adequacy decision by the European Commission. Excuse me. iProov authenticates online users, whatever their type of device, very simply and securely using face verification. We match a user's face to a trusted image. This might come from their passport or their driving license if they're enrolling, or from a trusted enrollment if they are a returning user. A person asserts an identity online, and we verify their face to check whether that assertion is true or false. Our speciality is to assure, very simply and usably, that the user not only resembles their trusted likeness, but is a real human being, physically present at the time of authentication. In this way, we protect users and organizations against impersonation by photos, videos, replayed recordings, or deepfake synthetic spoofs of them. Our service does not need to know the real identity of the user. Our customers, including the Home Office EU Settlement Scheme, the NHS, and many European enterprises, refer to users by anonymous pseudonyms when working with us. Using measures like this, face verification systems can be designed for privacy. In protecting citizens, the crucial consideration is rarely a technology itself, but how it's applied. The applications of face matching are varied and radically different between each other. The key distinction is between those applications that are for the benefit of the individual citizen, chosen by the individual citizen, and with the consent of the individual citizen, and those that may be for the benefit of wider society, but in which the user is neither given choice nor benefit from its use. So how does this distinction apply to face verification systems, such as those of iProov? Firstly, our user is informed of what is happening. The application, such as NHS login, tells the user their face is about to be verified. Then our user interface shows them a stylized image of their face. Pictures are more powerful than words, and the sight of their own features conveys to the user the unmistakable message that their face is about to be imaged. Secondly, the user consents. Verification is used to confirm a claim that the user makes about who they are. It is not used to identify them. They initiate the process that concludes with the verification, and consent is further assured along the way in the app and user interface. Consent is an absolute legal requirement for normal uses of their face verification under Article 9 of the GDPR. Thirdly, the user directly benefits. Face verification facilitates and secures the access to information and services. It makes the experience easier, more accessible, and more inclusive, and yet it protects them by securing their identity against impersonation or compromise. In the biometric balance, such user benefit must have its due weight. So there are two recommendations I'd like to offer parliamentarians. Firstly, the difference between face recognition and face verification is fundamental. Regulation of face recognition in surveillance must focus on the threats to privacy and the consequences of misidentification. The risks to privacy and civil liberties from face verification are substantially lower, provided GDPR is complied with in respect of consent, usage, and security. The benefits to individual users are considerable. Secure online enrollment at home is in practice not possible without it. Regulation that doesn't acknowledge the profound impacts of knowledge, consent, and benefit could deprive users of these benefits for no purpose. Finally, please consider the impact of if a European Commission GDPR adequacy decision or some effective alternative is not agreed by the 31st of December. Without such a decision, it will become illegal for British companies to process the personal data of European citizens without some special legal gymnastics, which will be resisted by major European customers. At iProov, we've laid contingency plans, but the damage caused to the export potential of the entire UK-based AI industry would be hard to exaggerate. Thank you very much.
Andrew, very clear message there at the end, so thank you for that. Always very helpful for parliamentarians. Tim.
Andrew, thank you. You make a powerful and passionate case for face verification, but in practice, I mean, how confused are people as the difference between facial recognition and face verification. Surely in practice, people do make the distinction, don't they?
Up until now, there hasn't been a great deal of confusion. People's emotional and direct responses to facial recognition in mass surveillance have been completely different and separate from their responses to face verification. We are starting to see the first signs of this elision in a regulatory context, and it's those that I think we have to be careful of. Already, I think in the GDPR, there is a little bit too much mixing of these two ideas. The constraints on face recognition are appropriate. The constraints on face verification, to some extent, in our view, are perhaps a little too severe. We're not trying to change them, but what I think is very important is that the confusion is not allowed to develop.
Thank you.
Excellent. Right, and over to our final speaker, which is Silkie Carlo, who is director of Big Brother Watch. Silkie.
Hello, thanks so much for having me and for the previous contributions. It was incredibly interesting. And for those of you who don't know, Big Brother Watch is a privacy and civil liberties organisation. We're a non-profit, and we've been working on facial recognition for several years now. And we've really been leading the campaign against the use of live facial recognition in the UK in particular. We did the first comprehensive report on this in 2018 on its use in the UK, and we initiated legal action shortly afterwards. I guess a good place to start is always with the kind of premise of the discussion. And so I wanted to first of all acknowledge that I will speak very briefly, mainly about live facial recognition and about facial recognition as used by corporations and by authorities, although I appreciate there are interesting research and scientific applications, particularly in the field of emotion recognition. But from a civil liberties point of view, of course, the former is more of interest to us. The very prospect of emotion recognition being used in the way that's been described in this call for commercial gain is absolutely frightful and really quite unthinkable. And I would say almost, I'll rein in what I would say about it, because I think this is an example of the really quite rabid surveillance capitalism that is seeking to profit and commercialize on every kind of organic and emotional output that humans have, and replacing natural organic processes with technology solutions where they're really not needed, and in ways that often ultimately lead to people being exploited or sometimes misunderstood. So I sincerely hope that that's not something that we see more of, but we are now, given the pandemic, there is now the risk of surveillance getting more and more under the skin, and when we're looking at emotion recognition, perhaps even into the mind. And I can't imagine really a riskier site of surveillance for civil liberties and human rights. So let's be incredibly cautious about that, and of course that's why we need regulation. We need something. Regulation is what the companies selling this kind of technology want, of course, because it's a life raft for something that's actually very dangerous to populations. So what we really are talking about is the search for standards, and where that search begins, perhaps even in some of these technologies where it ends, is with human rights. And we look at the rights impacts, they're absolutely extraordinary. Turning to live facial recognition in particular, first, obviously it poses a huge risk to privacy. It also poses a risk to freedom of assembly and freedom of association, and really turns the presumption of innocence on its head, because the use of it, particularly by police, as a kind of random checkpoint in a public place, which isn't sustainable. It will end up on CCTV networks if Parliament doesn't act now. Individuals are being checked to see if they are criminals. That is not how identity checks have ever worked in this country. We don't have that approach with fingerprints. We don't have it with DNA. and we shouldn't have it with facial biometrics. Yet tens of millions of people have already been scanned in this country, many of whom didn't even know about it. That's a breach of the Data Protection Act in and of itself. Well over 3,000 people have been misidentified by live facial recognition in this country. Our researchers found the technology being used in shopping centres, museums, stadiums, and even protests. And I've spent a lot of today trying to find out if the police were using facial recognition, live facial recognition at the protests yesterday, which I understand now they weren't, but there was so much fear about that among the demonstrators, and everyone's had their photos taken. It may very well be possible that post-event facial recognition is being used. And I think that's where the regulatory debate needs to happen, because we don't need to completely reinvent the wheel. We already have biometrics, we have fingerprints, we have DNA. There's clearly a use for facial recognition technology in a forensic setting. And that needs to be regulated in the way that other methods and approaches are regulated. But I think the question is much more straightforward in the case of live facial recognition. Again, we'll look to pre-existing standards. We don't have identity checkpoints in this country. We don't ask everyone, we don't ask millions of people at one time to undergo an identity check in the course of everyday life. Finally, I think I'm probably running out of time, so very quickly reference what we talk about when we talk about misidentifications and the general way that live facial recognition works. I would encourage everyone to think about this outside of just simply the relationship between an algorithm and an individual, because what I've seen on countless observations is it actually feeds into a culture of over-policing and suspicion, where you have lots of people suddenly being asked to account for themselves in a way that you wouldn't ordinarily see police do. On one occasion, I saw police using this in London, and they misidentified and stopped a 14-year-old boy. And it was a 14-year-old black boy, which is commonly what we see when this technology is used. He was pulled over by 4 plainclothed police officers who dragged him across to the side of the street. He was absolutely terrified. They demanded his fingerprints and did an identity check. They wanted to see ID card. He doesn't have an ID card. He's a child. He's in his school uniform. And I think in those moments, he formed a very, very negative view of the police, and as the police as a very oppressive institution. And that would be a fact-based analysis on what he'd just experienced. So we can't minimize, a lot of people think that, as soon as you just identify yourself as an innocent person, it's said and done. That's not the case. This has really long-lasting impact. And so my ultimate message and final message is, I think the case to ban live facial recognition is overwhelming, and that should be a priority. And then the other areas of this biometric technology need to be looked at for regulation.
Silkie, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure that will have generated some questions. Tim, being the first one.
Final question for me. Thank you, Stephen. I mean, Silkie, you've made a powerful case. You've talked about campaign and so on. I mean, is there a problem with getting traction from legislators towards a ban or a moratorium? Do you think that the campaign has built up steam, or do you think over the COVID crisis, actually, it's tended to not be as important as other aspects?
Well, there are honourable exceptions in this call, but generally my faith in parliamentary processes is diminishing, I have to say, because live facial recognition has been a glaring problem in this country. We've been out of step with the rest of Europe in pursuing it for now a case of years. And we do now have a situation where if the police wanted to be running around in facial recognition vans during the pandemic to police lockdown or to police the protests, which would lead to huge social divisions and really embarrass us on the international stage, they can. Because so far, very little has been done. And this is seen as a legitimate technology, which is following in the footsteps of China. Not to mention the fact that, all of our liberties have currently been suspended. under regulations that have never yet been in place with full and up-to-date approval of Parliament. So that we've got a wider problem with Parliament's ability to protect human rights in this country at the moment. But I'm warning you and raising alarm time and time again, this will come back to bite us in a terrible way. And if live facial recognition is used at these protests, where the tensions between police and the public are already very high, the result will be really bad.
Very much.
Thank you very much. Right. Just before I go to the general attendees for questions and ask Desiree to give me the steer on those, I've got Tamara Quinn who would like to ask a question. Tamara, over to you. I don't know if any of the other panelists or colleagues on the call would also like to make a point or a question before I open it up completely, but Tamara.
Thanks, Stephen. It's a question for Dr. Gangadharan. I hope I've got that right. And you mentioned that use of live AFR in public places, I think you said it creates intense path dependencies, which become harder to undo. I was just quite interested in that, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about it and perhaps give some examples. Thanks.
I'm just wondering if my comparison to the US case will be taken well, but I think that if you look, for example, at the ways in which law enforcement has attempted to adopt, for example, whether it's body-worn cameras or predictive policing, what has happened is, from a sort of institutional perspective, there's been, a contract with a technology vendor that comes with certain conditions, right? So you might have to, you might get the technology for free, but then the cost of storage might be priced at in a particular way that, then sort of as it is with ordinary consumers and products, where you have a sort of cheaper product at the outset and then the costs start to increase over time, right? So that's a pricing model that I think also applies to state contracts. And what happens, I think, what we've seen in the United States with the adoption of certain kinds of quote unquote innovative police technologies is that there's a big push for government innovation, and then a government grant that says, let's modernize the police force. And then there is, I think, a lot of rush to then outsource expertise outside of law enforcement. So what starts to happen is the very institution that's designed to ensure public safety in a democracy starts to disintegrate or starts to become disaggregated in a way that then sort of makes you say, well, what is law enforcement becoming anyway, right? If the expertise that I need to operate this system actually comes from outside of the expert community.
Thank you. Right. Andrew, I think you wanted a point of clarification around...
Yes, I was interested in asking some of the other panelists what their view was on the slightly grayer areas of live facial recognition, particularly involving large closed consenting user groups, such as people entering stadia, people checking in and boarding means of transport, or holders of COVID immunity passports seeking to enter large retail premises.
Any one of the panelists want to pick up on that?
I could.
Yes, Silkie.
I could bite.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, none of those sound particularly consensual to me. And as you know, consent has to be, in the data protection law sense, informed and freely given. If facial recognition is a condition of entry, and therefore to not consent would mean that you would not be able to go and support your favourite football team, or in the case of immunity passports, dare I even breathe that notion into existence, that you would not be able to go to work or earn a living or whatever else. It sets up quite a significant threshold, and I don't think in those cases that can be considered as meaningful consent. Of course, if an individual consents to do something like put facial recognition on their phone or whatever else in a true sense of consent, then that is a really different situation.
I'll just add really quickly that I think that there's a lot of really great behavioral research in the privacy and security community that demonstrates that there's vast amounts of information asymmetry between, for example, the party that's asking for consent and the party that's giving consent. And it's, obviously tipped to the parties that are asking for consent. And I think that it's also useful to think back to the sort of design benefit or advantage of face recognition, right? That the purpose of it, or one feature of it, has been to eliminate the need for human intervention in a verification process, as I understand it, right? So if that's sort of at its core, the design logic, then how could consent, a meaningful consent, factor in and be instantiated in that particular technology?
Thank you. If you don't mind me jumping in there for a second, as someone who builds this for the commercial side, so taking a lot of heat. One of the, it's not built to replace the human, and I need to make that very clear. So I think there may be actors out there who do that. But I think inside the business model design, if the company that is, it all starts and stops with the individual. Those companies that facilitate this technology, they don't have a business without the individuals participating. And therefore you have to pay attention to the controls and the consent forms that are out there, and operate within that environment and promote that environment and be a stanchion of hope in that environment. That's the only way you can do this as a business. And I have turned down contracts that have been very expensive contracts because the information would be abused in the end. So I think you do have to go after principles, and that has to factor into regulation.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Right, I'm going to now go to Desiree.
Yes.
Tell us.
The first audience question comes from David Elliman.
David, are you there?
Good evening, all. I believe to a large extent my question was asked on my behalf by Lord Clement-Jones. So I think, having listened to what everybody said, I think it opened out within the discussion. My point was whether the data that was obtained by interpreting emotions would be classed as PII, and therefore the right of ownership should always default to the citizen. And I think that we've discussed this rather a lot. I mean, my own personal opinion is that it absolutely should, and I think consent is not obvious in many cases. So it's been an interesting discussion as that's unfolded. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Desiree, who was next up?
The next one is Sandra Leighton-Gray.
Sandra?
Hello. Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
I'd like to ask about the situation as it relates to schools. Schools have a lot of budgetary control since local management schools in 1988. But as we know from all sorts of scandals, such as the photocopying, leasing scandal and so on, they're not always very well informed when it comes to procurement issues. And indeed, they've installed a lot of biometric equipment and things like that, not always with the best of due diligence. This type of facial recognition project is being flogged very enthusiastically to them, perhaps despite the lack of procurement or maybe because of it. What dangers are there to children with introducing it in schools, and how can we mitigate these dangers?
Thank you, Sandra. Would anyone like to try and address that particular problem or issue, I should say? Matt?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in if you want.
Thank you.
So I'm actually not familiar with the stuff in the UK, so I'm just going to put my hand up on that one. I don't know what's going on here. Where we were approached were countries that are kind of high technology usage countries, looking at smart city programs. where they're dealing with over 360 schools, and a lot of their learning, so every student is issued a Chromebook, and a lot of the learning is done online, which means you don't have the face-to-face with the teachers all the time. But also, it was actually because the amount of students was outgrowing the amount of teachers and the expertise you could get. So the challenge for them was very much, how do I know the point of confusion for the student when they're doing a lot of their learning outside of the classroom through the technology, and be able to tutor them before they have to get to their exam, because in some of these cultures, performance in exams is a major blocker to their future success in that society. So in those cases, that's where I think it's good. But I think I think your point around expertise and knowledge, you couldn't be more correct on that, in that this is a buyer beware, and very much they should be able to put the screws to the vendor as part of the education and procurement process.
Thanks, Matt. I think Matthias wants to come in.
Yeah, maybe I'm not familiar enough with the situation in Britain and the context of the question that was asked, but my first response to the question of using these systems in school is, why would anyone do that at all? It's, you know, when you're talking about the systems that apparently try to help students, you know, detect their frustration with any learning material or something like that, you know, we could even debate that, although personally, I think this is quite an Orwellian scenario, which was mentioned before. But if we are talking about facial recognition and live detection of faces in schools for whatever purposes, for example, entry control or things like that, why would we as a society think that this could be a useful use of such technology, building a database of pupils' faces for these purposes? How can this be ever an adequate use of such technology? This is of course not really an answer to such a question, but I would like to relay my astonishment about the fact that this is even considered.
Nice, thank you. Okay, Desiree, who's up next?
Next question comes from Christine Cho.
Christine?
Hi,
Hi,
this
Christine.
is Christine here. I think there was a lot of discussion about distinguishing between the challenges and opportunities between government use and also commercial use. And I think that as a potential data subject of such use, I would definitely like to be able to opt into certain users, because I know that some of them would be part of my citizen duty to enforce public safety. But at the same time, I feel that as a data subject, it is also my right to be able to know when my facial features or my personal information is being used to be targeted for marketing. So how can government policy provide a framework to require companies to distinguish and made it very clear and explicit when information is being used for government, for public safety purposes, but also and to contrast that with commercial use, because at the moment it's very unclear, and it seems that companies, when they do that, it says just say that because it is what the government requests require. I mean, is it true though? And what kind of framework can be provided to protect my rights as a data subject? Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Anyone want to try and...
Could I make a general point?
Yes.
That certainly commercial uses of any kind of face imagery is governed by Article 9 of the GDPR, as enshrined in the UK Data Protection Act, which makes it absolutely essential to provide that the user provides informed consent. A part of what that information is what the data is going to be used for. So the collection of data, the collection of facial imagery must be consented on the basis of what the data is going to be used for. So if somebody collects it for purpose A, and they would like to provide it for marketing purposes, they have to make that explicit. If they don't make that explicit, they're breaking the law. Now, how far that law is is complied with today and is enforced today and tomorrow is of course a separate issue, but the penalties for non-compliance can be quite severe.
I can say a little bit about the extent to which the law is actually being observed on that point. It's not really being observed at all. We found many examples of live facial recognition being used in the UK, partly because the inaction seems to have kind of given a green light to private companies to start using this. But we found a string of places that we published in August last year, including museums, shopping centres and other places that had been using live facial recognition either by themselves or in cooperation with the police and not telling members of the public about it. This wasn't being used in a covert setting, it was being used really kind of for experimentation and to police. In fact, this happened at King's Cross. For 2 years, live facial recognition was being used and no one knew about it. In the centre of London with millions of people coming through. One of the big problems that we've got is that even with the bare regulations that we have in data protection to start to address this are not being enforced properly because the ICO is either incapable because it's underfunded or overworked, or I don't really know. They have gone absent without leave, I'm afraid. This does create a very big problem for the protection of citizens right now, and really increases the impetus on Parliament to try to legislate in the area.
Silkie, thank you. Right. Desiree?
Yes, next question will be from Sebastian Krier.
Sebastian?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, hi there. I'm Sebastian, I'm a lawyer and I previously worked with the UK Office for AI. And my question here was, so what's the best way to ensure that AI outputs are presented, used and understood as what they kind of actually are? So, inferences and not objective truth. And, what type, before someone says regulation, I suppose what type of regulation requirement or framework specifically would help address that? And I suppose accountability more broadly as well.
Sebastian, thank you. Anyone fancy tackling that question?
I'm not so sure that explainability or that goal of explainability is achievable. I mean, if you're talking about, for example, an ordinary consumer, I mean, I'd love to be challenged on this, but the complexity with which machines learn, I think, make it very challenging to explain where, for example, bias exists, or where, a false positive was identified, right? I think it's almost as if it's too complex to explain beyond saying a machine learning system is opaque and might make decisions based on ground truths that could be changing and or subjective, as our colleague at UCL was saying.
Thank you. Wasn't there, I may have misremembered this, but wasn't there a move away from explainability because of that exact problem to repeatability and predictability, that any AI would come up with the results that you thought it would come up with, and that you would have a testing regime rather than an explainability regime?
That is certainly something that we've seen in practice. I can't speak for every AI player out there, but on our side, I mean, one of the things we do, it's not actually the ability or inability to identify false positives. We actually specifically go after that stuff. What the hard part is as to why it's happening. So to your point, that's actually the difficulty to dig into, because even sometimes it might not actually be the ground truth data set. It might be the fuzziness of the webcams because you're dealing in a country that just has last year's technology. And so it really, you have a number of different factors that can come into play. And so we focus on trainability and transferability, which then leads to which is measured by reliability and consistency in the output. but you can't identify the false positives. That's not as much the issue. The issue is actually why they're occurring is much harder.
Thank you very much. Right, Desiree, do we have?
Yeah, the last question comes from Ben Byford.
Okay, Ben, you're our last questioner.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, so I just have 3 quick points. Actually, in reference to the last question and Seeta's response, I think I can say briefly as a teacher of data science and machine learning techniques that not all algorithms are actually unexplainable or in that context unknowable. The reference there is probably to deep learning and those techniques which are obviously relevant to this conversation with facial recognition mostly. So I take that as a point, but I think the inference question actually refers to, are we going to educate people? Are we going to educate citizens or educate police forces or the users or such technology sufficiently so that they can understand the outcomes of these algorithms so that they can make human-based judgments which are appropriate for the circumstance? So that would be my first point on that. Secondly, I really think there's a nuance of usage here. With most technologies, you can use in different ways, and there are many, many different use cases for governments and for private sectors in this case. It would be really interested for me as a podcaster and practitioner to understand what are permissible uses of face tracking for citizens, for both the government and the private sector. What are the kinds of things that we could deem okay to be used, and we've had some of those before talked about this evening in maybe in finding lost citizens or tracking down people for forensic use. And lastly, I'd just like to say that I've had my face tracked in several countries, recently in the UAE. So this stuff is already happening, and I wonder if there's a moratorium that needs to be reached globally to actually facilitate any citizen making any global travel or being satisfied that they won't be prosecuted in the places that they travel to. So thank you.
Ben, thank you very much. Anyone want to pick up on any of those points?
Yeah, I wanted to just pick up on the international aspect of it, because we are talking about individual governments as if individual governments can make a big difference, but really it is about global collaboration about this, because also I have been traveling and got my face recognized in many different countries now. And if governments don't agree, we have a problem. Also, the big tech giants who now own, I think that with Mark Zuckerberg, all his Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp and the rest, we have with more than 3 billion people are sharing the data on a daily basis. So, and we also have now all the apps with face filters, etc., where the real data are collected to create a face filter. So I just think that it's a global issue. It is about the global companies need to set corporate standards, and it is a government that needs to collaborate and to believe that the citizens' participation, we can manage our own data, I think is impossible.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I just?
Yes, who's that?
I'll make the point really quick, which is, I appreciate Ben's questions, and I think with respect, so I can't say I'm an expert on, missing children and things of that nature, but with any technology, the question should always be, what do you have to give up in order for this technology to be successfully deployed in a society, right? What do you have to give up, and what is already working, for example, in the case of missing children? What is already working? And this is a question that if you've worked in local communities and in particularly vulnerable communities, this kind of question of sort of what we need as Professor Berthouze was saying earlier, right? This question of how do we actually surface the things that we need in society? And it may very well be the case that the technical solution is not the solution that we need. We need actually something else. It might be fair distribution of resources. It might be a different methodology for tracking and tracing missing children, or whatever other social problem that's on the horizon. But I think it can be really dangerous to put all of our eggs in a technological solution basket.
You and Andrew, did you have a?
Yes, could I? Two very quick points. One is this question of moratorium, which actually goes back to Silkie's point earlier about enforcement. Moratoriums are necessary when existing regulations are insufficient and they're not enforced. Existing regulations, as I think has been said on a number of occasions, really do go quite a long way to protecting civil rights. But as she points out, it's very difficult for regulators to enforce them. But in the context of GDPR, there's been very little discussion about a potentially much more powerful means of protecting consumers' interests, which is not the regulators' fines under, I think it's Article 80 of GDPR, but the opportunity under Article 82 for consumers to launch class action suits for non-monetary damages. This is one of those things that people haven't talked about, but it potentially is an unexploded bomb under those who would abuse live facial verification in defiance of the regulations. Even if the regulators don't go after them for fines, it's quite possible for classes of consumers to go after abusers and hurt them very much, and that would have a very powerful deterrent effect. The second point I'd make very briefly is on this issue of explainability. I think explainability will become an absolute social and cultural requirement, even on difficult to explain systems like deep learning systems. For 400 years, the whole of human progress since the Enlightenment has been about providing better explanations of things that happen than things that we do. The idea that we're now moving to a world of black boxes, which will make decisions for us which we are not entitled to know about, to me, I think will be seen increasingly as a step back into witchcraft and will become socially unacceptable. So I think actually explainability will become a fundamental social requirement in one way or another for the future of AI.
Okay, thank you very much. And on that point, I'm going to draw this discussion to a close. I think it's been a really interesting and enlightening discussion, lots of different viewpoints, a good exchange, some great questions. So on behalf of all of us, can I thank our 7 speakers, Nadia, Temitayo, Matt, Seeta, Matthias, Andrew and Silkie. Thank you all very much for your contribution. Also thank you to Birgitte and to Desiree and all the team at the Big Innovation Centre for making this possible. And on behalf of my co-chair, Clement-Jones and I, thank you for attending. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have, and we'll see you at the next one. Thanks very much.
Thank
you. Good night.